It is a grey October morning in the port of Catania, Sicily. The kind of morning where the sea sits flat and silver, where the air smells of salt and wood smoke and the ordinary rhythms of life. A dock worker is dragging rope along the quay when he notices the ships. 12 galleys, their sails hanging slack and colourless, drifting toward the harbour like vessels that have forgotten their purpose. He squints. There is no one at the railings. No sailors calling out for guidance. No hands waving toward the dock. The ships come in the way, dead things float downriver without intention, without urgency, simply carried by whatever force remains. He calls out. Nothing comes back but the sound of water against the hull. He boards the nearest vessel. The deck is wet with something darker than seawater. He steps forward and sees the first man slumped against a coil of rope, his neck grotesquely swollen, his skin mottled in deep, bruised tones of purple and black, his lips crusted with something that had once been blood. The man's eyes are open. Around him, more bodies, some still breathing in shallow, terrible gasps. Their fingers blackened to the tips. A smell so thick it has a physical presence, the smell of something biological and ancient and deeply wrong. He runs. He does not know it yet, but in that single moment of boarding that ship, the fate of an entire continent has shifted. What arrived in those galleys was not merely a disease, it was a reckoning, a force so total, so indiscriminate, so cosmically indifferent to rank or faith or virtue, that it would unmake the world Europe had spent 3 centuries constructing. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death would kill somewhere between 75 and 200 million human beings. In some regions, every other person you had ever known would be dead within 18 months. In others, it would be worse. This is the story of how it happened. And before we follow the plague into the heart of Europe, we need to understand exactly what it was destroying. By the middle of the 14th century, Europe had convinced itself it was living through something extraordinary. And it was right, just not in the way it believed. The continent's population had nearly tripled since the year 1000, reaching an estimated 75 million souls spread across a landscape of thriving cities, expanding trade networks, and architectural ambitions that would astonish later generations. Paris was a city of perhaps 200,000 people, the largest settlement Northern Europe had seen since Rome fell. Its streets were dense with scholars, merchants, pilgrims and beggars, all jostling beneath the rising limestone spires of Notre Dame Cathedral, a building so geometrically improbable that contemporaries whispered it could only have been constructed with divine assistance. The universities of Bologna, Oxford and Paris were producing a generation of thinkers who believed, with genuine intellectual confidence, that they were close to a complete understanding of the cosmos. The philosopher Thomas Aquinas had woven together the teachings of Aristotle with Christian theology into a framework so elegant and comprehensive that it seemed to answer every question worth asking, from the movement of planets to the moral obligations of kings. It was a closed intellectual system, a finished picture. Medieval Europeans lived inside a worldview that felt total. God was at the center of everything, his logic expressed in the natural order, his will interpreted by the church, his judgments legible to those learned enough to read them. The Black Death would not merely kill people, it would detonate this entire architecture of meaning. And yet, beneath the confidence, the cracks were already forming. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had swept through northern Europe with a ferocity that killed perhaps 10% of the population in affected regions. Crops failed for 7 consecutive years. People ate horses, then dogs, then things no one wrote down explicitly. Chroniclers recorded parents abandoning children, children abandoning parents, mass graves dug in hurry and prayer. The famine passed, but it left a population that was nutritionally depleted, immunologically weakened, and crammed into cities whose sanitation infrastructure had never been designed for the density now straining it. This was the Europe that would receive what was coming. Half a world away, in the mountain valleys of what we now call Kyrgyzstan, something had changed in the biology of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would become the Black Death. Recent archaeological analysis of plague victims buried near Lake Issyk-Kul in Central Asia has traced the genetic origin of the 14th century pandemic to this region with remarkable precision. Tombstone inscriptions from 1338 and 1339 record an unusual surge in deaths, and the DNA extracted from those graves carries the unmistakable signature of the same strain that would devastate Europe a decade later. Yersinia pestis had coexisted with humanity's wild neighbors for millennia, lurking in the colonies of marmots, gerbils, and ground squirrels that dotted the Eurasian steppe. Most of the time, it remained a quiet biological tenant in its rodent hosts, periodically spilling into human populations without achieving sustained transmission. But sometime in the early 14th century, a mutation, or more likely a cascade of mutations shaped by shifting climate, disrupted ecosystems, and the dense pressures of trade transformed it into something categorically different. A pathogen capable of moving through human populations with the speed and completeness of fire through dry grass. It found its highway in the Silk Road. Think of the Silk Road not as a single route, but as a vast nervous system connecting the known world, a web of paths stretching from the Chinese coast through Central Asia, Persia, the Caucasus, and into the ports of the Black Sea. Along this network moved silk and spices, silver and manuscripts, scholars and soldiers, ideas and beliefs. It was the original globalization, humanity's earliest experiment in radical interconnection. And like all networks, it carried not only what its users intended to carry. The plague followed the merchants. It followed the Mongol couriers who rode between the cities of the Golden Horde. It followed the caravans loaded with goods destined for Genoese trading posts on the Crimean coast. By 1346, it had reached the city of Caffa, a fortified trading settlement on the Black Sea shore, now called Feodosia in modern Ukraine, and there it staged one of history's most consequential sieges. The Mongol forces of Jani Beg had surrounded Caffa with an army. Then the plague moved through that army like a fire moves through a forest. Men died faster than they could be buried. The siege collapsed, not through military failure, but through biological catastrophe. And according to the Franciscan chronicler Gabriel de Musis, the Mongol commander, refusing to accept that a disease could accomplish what his warriors could not order, the corpses of his plague-dead soldiers loaded into catapults and hurled over the city walls. It may be the first recorded act of biological warfare in human history. It may also be, in terms of consequences, the most significant. The Genoese merchants inside Caffa, watching their city fill with the stench of plague dead, made the only rational decision available to them. They loaded their ships and fled. Please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. It is always incredible to see people joining us from so many different places around the world. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people, and there is so much more history to come. The 12 galleys that drifted into Catania and then Messina in October 1347 were the leading edge of a catastrophe that had been traveling west for years. The Sicilian authorities understood, on some animal level, that what had arrived was profoundly dangerous. They ordered the ships out of port, but the rats had already gone ashore, the fleas had already fed. The bacterium had already found new hosts in the narrow streets and crowded markets of the island's port towns. The plague moved through Sicily and into the Italian peninsula with a speed that defied the era's infrastructure. Within weeks, it was in Genoa. Within months, Venice. By the spring of 1348, it had crossed the Alps and was advancing through France. By summer, it had reached England. By 1350, it was in Scandinavia. In 3 years, it crossed a continent carried not by soldiers or deliberate act, but by the ordinary commerce of daily life. Every market, every pilgrimage, every shipment of wool or grain became a vector. The 3 forms it took were each, in their own way, a different kind of horror. Bubonic plague, the most common, announced itself through the swelling of the lymph nodes. The buboes that gave it its name could grow to the size of a fist, emerging in the groin, the armpit, or the neck, hard and burning and exquisitely painful. Contemporary physicians described them as God's tokens, divine marks that signaled certain death. Most victims died within a week of their appearance. Some burst, releasing quantities of blood and pus and a smell that witnesses never forgot, that appeared in their accounts decades later, still reaching for language equal to the memory. Pneumonic plague entered through the lungs. A man might wake with a cough and be dead by evening, having spent his last hours drowning in fluid while his lips turned blue and blood stained his breath. This form required no rats, no fleas, only proximity, a shared meal, a whispered prayer at a bedside, the breath between 2 people who loved each other. Entire households vanished in single nights. Septicemic plague was the rarest and the fastest. The bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, overwhelming the body's defenses so rapidly that death came before the characteristic swellings even appeared. Victims simply darkened the extremities, turning black as circulation failed, hence the name that history would give to the entire event. They were observed to be dying while still walking, their fingers and toes already the color of deep bruises, their skin mottled and cold while their hearts still beat. Medieval medicine met all 3 forms with the same inadequacy. The dominant understanding of disease was inherited from ancient Greek thought, the theory of humours, which held that illness resulted from an imbalance in the 4 fundamental fluids of the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. A good physician adjusted these fluids through diet, bloodletting, herbal preparations, and the careful manipulation of a patient's environment. It was an internally coherent system with a long and sometimes genuinely useful history. Against Yersinia pestis, it was nothing. Physicians prescribed theriac, an ancient remedy containing dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh, opium, and various spices, whose preparation took months and whose cost placed it beyond ordinary reach. They recommended the application of live chickens to the buboes to draw out the corruption. They advised patients to flee the corrupted air of cities for cleaner environments, a recommendation that, while medically mistaken in its reasoning, inadvertently moved infected people from crowded urban centers into rural areas where they infected entirely new populations. A physician in Montpellier, one of Europe's most distinguished medical centers, wrote in despairing honesty that he had never seen anything like it, that his training offered him no foothold, that he watched his patients die faster than he could document their symptoms. Think of it this way. Imagine modern emergency rooms suddenly filling with a pathogen that ignored every antibiotic ever synthesized, laughed at ventilators, and killed within hours. Imagine watching your most sophisticated treatments achieve precisely nothing. The psychological collapse of the medieval medical establishment was not merely professional humiliation. It was the destruction of an entire framework for understanding how the world worked. And here is where the story becomes not just a medical catastrophe, but a civilizational one. If disease was divine punishment, which virtually every educated European in 1347 believed, then the scale of the Black Death required a sin so immense as to be almost impossible to identify. What had humanity done to deserve the death of half its children? The flagellant movement spread from Germany and Central Europe across the continent in 1349, groups of men and women moving from town to town in organized processions, stripping to the waist in public squares and beating themselves with leather straps tipped with iron spikes until blood ran freely down their backs. They sang hymns of penitence and called on crowds to repent before the final judgment arrived. Some contemporaries believed they were holy, others feared them. The Church, initially uncertain, eventually condemned the movement, partly because it was becoming impossible to control, and partly because the flagellants' gatherings were functioning as precise and efficient mechanisms for spreading the very plague they were attempting to appease. A darker impulse found its expression in the persecution of Jewish communities. Across Germany, France, and Switzerland, rumors spread that Jewish people had caused the plague by poisoning wells. The accusations were not merely implausible, they were demonstrably false. Jewish mortality from the plague was statistically identical to Christian mortality. The disease killed everyone. But the psychological need for a comprehensible enemy, for an agent of human malice rather than blind biological chance, proved stronger than evidence. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, the city's Jewish population of approximately 2,000 people was burned alive in mines in Cologne. In hundreds of smaller towns across the German lands, entire communities were massacred. Pope Clement VI issued papal bulls explicitly stating that Jewish people were not responsible for the plague and that those who harmed them were acting against the Church's teaching. The massacres continued regardless. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. It is always amazing to see people joining us from around the world. In the countryside, the plague's impact was sometimes even more complete than in the cities. Urban populations had, at minimum, the capacity to organize emergency responses, the digging of mass graves, the establishment of isolation measures, the mobilization of what remained of civic and religious authority. Villages had no such resources. When the plague arrived in a settlement of 200 people, there was no institution large enough to absorb the shock. Families simply died, house by house, until there were too few survivors to maintain the social order that had governed their lives for generations. In England alone, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 villages were abandoned during and after the Black Death, their populations dead or dispersed, their fields reverting to scrub, their church towers standing in emptying landscapes for decades before anyone thought to tear them down. Medieval historians call them deserted medieval villages, a phrase whose clinical neutrality barely contains what it describes. We walk across those fields today in Oxfordshire, in Lincolnshire, in Norfolk, and beneath our feet are the earthwork outlines of streets that once carried ordinary morning life and now carry nothing but grass. London's death toll was staggering. Archaeological excavation at East Smithfield in the 1980s and 90s uncovered emergency burial grounds established in 1348, where bodies had been laid in careful rows at first, then stacked. As the space ran short and the dead outnumbered the living fast enough to overwhelm any orderly system, the Thames, normally crowded with merchant traffic, carried instead a different cargo downstream. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague and wrote about it in the preface to his Decameron, described scenes of social dissolution so total that they read, even now, as almost impossible to believe. Neighbors refused to speak to neighbors. Fathers retreated from plague-sick children. Husbands fled wives. Wives fled husbands. Bodies lay in streets for hours, sometimes days, before anyone gathered the courage to move them. Churches held so many daily masses for the dead that the bells that marked each service eventually fell silent, not from any decision, but simply because there were too few living hands to pull the ropes. The fundamental architecture of medieval society rested on a set of obligations between lord and serf, between priest and congregation, between the living and their dead. The Black Death dissolved those obligations so completely and so rapidly that when it finally receded, neither party could quite remember what they had previously owed each other. Labor was suddenly scarce, in a world that had been built on its abundance. For a medieval peasant before 1347, the options were limited. Land was finite. Lords were powerful. The negotiating position of anyone who worked the earth was essentially nothing. You did what was asked of you, paid what was demanded of you, and were grateful for the security of the arrangement even when the security was thin. After 1353, this entire calculus had inverted. Lords looked at their estates and saw fields unplanted, harvests rotting in place, the economic infrastructure of their power literally decomposing for want of workers. Surviving peasants looked at the same landscape and saw something they had never previously possessed: leverage. They moved to neighboring estates that offered better terms. They negotiated wages that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Some simply walked away from their ancestral villages entirely and reinvented themselves in the anonymity of the nearest town. The English Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to legally freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from seeking better terms. The law was widely ignored. Economic reality, it turned out, was more powerful than parliamentary decree. The feudal order did not collapse overnight. It took another century and a half of grinding social change. But the Black Death had cut the threads that held it together, and nothing that came after could fully resew them. The Church faced its own reckoning. The clergy had died at rates even higher than the general population, not because they were specially vulnerable biologically, but because their role required them to enter the homes of the sick and dying, to hear confession, to administer last rites, to handle the bodies of the plague dead with their bare hands. Monasteries that had accumulated centuries of manuscripts, of medical and philosophical knowledge, of the slow intellectual labor of generations, were emptied within weeks. Some were never resettled. Their libraries molded. New priests were ordained in haste, with training measured in months rather than the years the Church had previously required. The quality of spiritual leadership deteriorated visibly. More profoundly, the prestige of institutional religious authority had been damaged in a way that could not be repaired by simply ordaining more priests. People had watched their most learned and devout clergy die as helplessly as anyone else. The idea that proximity to God conferred protection, not spiritual protection, but actual physical exemption from the plague's indifferent progress, had been empirically disproved in every town in Europe. Intellectually, The certainty that had characterized the pre-plague generation began to crack. Artists who had painted saints with serene, golden certainty began to paint differently. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became one of the most popular artistic motifs of the late 14th and 15th centuries. It depicted death as a skeletal figure leading a procession of figures from every rank of society, pope and peasant, king and child, merchant and monk, in an eternal, equalizing dance toward the grave. It was a statement of profound theological disruption. If everyone went the same way, regardless of their virtue or their station, then what exactly was the divine order guaranteeing? And it was a question that, once asked, could not be easily unasked. What remained, when the dying finally slowed, was a Europe that was smaller, quieter, and in certain ways more open than the one that had existed before. The demographic recovery took 2 centuries. Some regions did not reach their pre-plague population levels until the 17th century. But within that emptied, haunted landscape, possibilities had appeared that the crowded, confident world of 1340 had not permitted. Wages remained relatively elevated, social mobility increased, the grip of inherited status loosened, not enough, by modern standards, but measurably. The survivors who rebuilt the world rebuilt it with a different set of assumptions about what was fixed and what was negotiable. The intellectual ferment that followed the plague's passage, the desperate attempt to explain what had happened, to build new frameworks capable of accommodating a catastrophe that the old ones had so completely failed to predict or prevent, contributed, over the following century, to the conditions that made the Renaissance possible. Whether that constitutes a silver lining is a question worth sitting with. 200 million people died. The transformation of European intellectual life that followed is real. Whether one thing justified the other is not a question history can answer for us. What the Black Death does offer us, across the distance of nearly 700 years, is a mirror. It shows us what happens when a civilization mistakes its current arrangements for permanent truths. When confidence in an existing framework becomes so total that the framework's vulnerabilities are invisible. When the networks that carry prosperity also carry catastrophe, and no one in authority has imagined that the second is possible because the first has been working so well for so long. It shows us how human beings behave under extreme pressure, some with extraordinary courage, nursing the sick and burying the dead, and maintaining, at genuine personal cost, the obligations that others had abandoned, and some with the particular cruelty of people who cannot tolerate the randomness of catastrophe and construct human enemies to substitute for biological ones. It shows us, perhaps most unexpectedly, what survives. A survivor's letter from the monastery of Canterbury, written sometime in 1350 or 1351, reads, "We who remain are far fewer than before, and yet the fields are planted, and yet the bells ring for matins, and yet the children who were born in the worst years grow now towards something we cannot yet see, and it is not nothing." The letter's author was writing about crops and liturgy, but he was also, without quite knowing it, writing about the fundamental stubbornness of human continuation, the refusal, even in the wreckage, to stop expecting a next year. The Black Death was the worst thing that ever happened to medieval Europe. It was also the event that ended the medieval world and, in the long and grinding aftermath, began the world that came after. The question it leaves us with is the same question every catastrophe eventually asks. What do you rebuild? What do you keep? What do you let go? The survivors of 1353 had to answer that question with their hands in the soil without knowing what history would eventually make of their choices. We have the advantage of knowing what they built. The question is whether we are paying attention to how they did it. Please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.